Okay, so I understand that Vernon and Petunia aren't going to punish Dudley for being a bully, and certainly not when Harry is the victim. But why aren't the teachers at this school stepping in to protect Harry and stop Dudley and his gang from running wild on the school grounds? It seems that Hogwarts isn't the only school in this universe that's astronomically negligent. Spoiler warning, this is an in-depth retrospective and story analysis of the entirety of the Harry Potter books, one chapter at a time. If this is your first video in the series, it is highly recommended that you begin watching this series from the beginning, which you can do by going to the playlist that I provide right here. Okay, now that everyone is all caught up, let's continue. 10 years have passed since the events of the first chapter. It turns out that the letter that Dumbledore left with Harry did some good, as it invoked what little humanity Vernon and Petunia had that compelled them to take Harry into their home. Of course, that must have sucked up what little humanity they had, because while they had taken Harry into their home, they treat him like complete trash, complete with forcing him to sleep in the cupboard under the stairs, and always leaving him with some old woman named Fig, as well as constantly verbally berating him. As the narrator, now speaking exclusively through Harry's eyes, explains, the Dursleys often spoke about Harry as though he wasn't there, or rather as though he was something very nasty that couldn't understand them like a slug. In a post-series interview, J.K. Rowling explains that the Dursleys believed that by being nasty enough to Harry, they could hopefully get him to suppress his magical ability and bottle it up inside him. So their abuse towards him was actually a concentrated effort on their part to snuff the magical power out of him. Anyway, it is now Dudley's birthday, which means it's time for Harry to be left with Miss Fig. But there's a problem. Fig broke her leg and has to spend the day at the hospital, meaning she can't take Harry. They have to wonder who actually made the call on Fig's behalf. Did she frantically make sure to call the Dursleys before she called for an ambulance because she actually feared the Dursleys? Did she call from the hospital? If so, why would the hospital allow her to call anyone but her own family? Bear in mind that this chapter is set before cell phones became very commonplace, so she couldn't have called from her bedside. She had to get out of bed, broken leg and all, to make this call. So anyway, with no other alternative, they agree to take Harry with them to the zoo on Dudley's birthday party. He actually has the most fun he's had in a long time, but then he gets into a conversation with a snake. Harry is surprisingly blasé over the fact that he can suddenly talk to snakes. I mean, sure, he's a wizard, but he doesn't know that yet. So why isn't he more freaked out by this? Has he talked to snakes before? Well, no, that can't be it, because in Chamber of Secrets, he states in no uncertain terms that this trip to the zoo was indeed the first time it happened. So how come Harry is showing only the most base level of surprise at the fact that he can talk to snakes? So anyway, Dudley and his friend Piers run up to check out the snake that Harry was having a conversation with, and knock Harry down in the process. You know, you'd think Harry would be used to this treatment by this point, but apparently he was so angry and embarrassed by it that he subconsciously made the glass disappear. This gets him grounded for an entire year. Yeah, think about it, this happened on Dudley's birthday. In Half-Blood Prince, Petunia states that Harry is a month younger than Dudley. We know that Harry's birthday is July 31st. That's pretty consistent throughout the entire series. So Dudley's birthday must be near the end of June. Now, here in the United States, summer vacation begins at the end of May and ends at the first half of August. But in these books, which I presume adhere to the British school year, summer vacation lasts until the end of June and the beginning of September. The narrator says that by the time he was left out of his cupboard, the summer holidays had come, which means that he either only spent a few days grounded or an entire year. I'm assuming the latter, because the narrator also says that this was Harry's longest punishment yet. And so the chapter ends with Harry lamenting about how he doesn't have any friends, and how he had long since given up hope of someone whisking him away to a place where he could be happy. As far as plot advancement is concerned, this chapter is mostly dedicated to setting up how abusive the Dursleys are to Harry. At least half the chapter is dedicated mostly to giving example after example after example of the Dursleys being abusive both physically and verbally to Harry, with very little cohesion between each example. Anytime Harry does anything magical, Vernon and Petunia realize that it's Harry's magical ability at work, even if they'll never admit it out loud, and as Rowling explains in her post-series lore contributions, they believe, although they have absolutely nothing to base this on, that treating him harshly is the best way to beat the magic out of him. I wonder if they actually believe Harry when he says that he can't explain how these things always happen around him, but punish him for subconscious magic anyway, simply because they believe that punishing him will somehow get him to control his magic, even when they don't explain to him that he's actually doing magic. This is why Harry wasn't punished for making the shirt shrink, because Petunia was able to come up with a non-magical explanation for how it happened. You know, I'd really like to know what made the Dursleys think that this was the best course of action. Bear in mind that this chapter takes place in the late 1980s or early 1990s, and the majority of Harry's upbringing took place in the 1980s, so it's not like the Dursleys had access to the internet so they could consult with like-minded people like Mary Lou Bearborn on how to actually get magical children to suppress their magic. And the last thing I'd expect of the Dursleys is going around in public asking people for advice on how to do that without the anonymity of the internet to keep their actions secret. Now, last episode, somebody actually posted a comment where he relayed a fan theory he heard. Apparently he's only a casual fan of Harry Potter because this fan theory has been debunked 11 ways to Sunday by the most hardcore fans of the series. That the Dursleys only act this way because Harry is a Horcrux, and since Ron Weasley became a dickhead whenever he wore Slytherin's locket, so too are the Dursleys becoming bitter and mean-spirited because they are in close proximity to Harry. No, wrong. Look, the theory is debunked as early as the first chapter. Yeah, I know this discussion was probably best left to the last episode, but I honestly didn't think to include this discussion last episode because this fan theory has been put to rest long ago by the hardcore fans, and I made last episode with the expectation that this fan theory would stay in the grave where it belonged. So I'm going to have to do a little backpedaling because apparently my fans need to be brought up to speed on this topic. The first half of the previous chapter was dedicated almost exclusively to building up how much the Dursleys hated wizards and as well as anything abnormal. This was before they even took Harry into their homes, and so their hatred of magic in that chapter couldn't have been because Harry was a Horcrux, right? But even barring that, if this fan theory were true, why are the Dursleys the only ones who were mean to Harry? Shouldn't Ron and Hermione, and for that matter the entire Weasley family, have also fallen victim to the Horcrux's influence? They poured their heart and soul into their friendship with Harry just as much as Ginny did with Tom Riddle's diary. So why weren't they ever possessed by Voldemort like Ginny was? But even barring that, no other Horcrux in the entire franchise has ever caused anyone who got close to it to being a dickhead to the Horcrux itself. When Ron wore Slytherin's locket around his neck, and while we're on the topic, remember that he had to be wearing the locket. Simply being within a 10-yard radius of the locket wasn't enough. Hell, even holding it in his hand wasn't enough. He became a dickhead to those around him, Harry and Hermione, not to the locket itself. So if the Dursleys were being affected by Harry's Horcrux, their sudden aggression should be directed towards each other, not to Harry himself. So sorry, but the fan theory that Harry's Horcrux is what caused the Dursleys to be so nasty to him just does not hold up to even the most casual of scrutiny. It completely ignores 99% of the entire series, as well as everything we know about how Horcruxes actually work. Now, don't get me wrong, I absolutely understand people's desire to inject some dimension and sympathy into these characters. As I pointed out last episode, villains with dimension and depth are more realistic and provide for a more immersive story. but sadly, you're plugging the square peg in the round hole. J.K. Rowling is trash at writing villains with dimension and believability to their actions, and so you're trying to assign traits to characters who were simply never designed for these traits. Besides, even if we're going to try and add depth to the series' villains using headcanon, don't you think our efforts would be better spent trying to give sympathy to Voldemort, since, you know, he's the main villain of this series? So anyway, about the rest of this chapter, we definitely see more instances of proper foreshadowing than we see in the first chapter. Two things that are foreshadowed in this chapter that will become important later on are Harry's ability to talk to snakes, and the green light he remembers when his parents died. The latter, however, is kind of lazily handled. No matter how hard Harry tries, he can't remember anything except the green light. But if that only happened when he was just a year old, how does he remember even that much? From a literary standpoint, the reason he remembers the green light is for that big reveal moment in Goblet of Fire when he sees the killing curse for the first time since he's old enough to retain his memories. But in-universe, it just feels rather plot convenient that he remembers the green light and absolutely nothing else about that moment. Harry's ability to talk to snakes, however, isn't off the hook here either. While it is much more reasonable in-universe that Harry would be put in a situation where he would discover this ability, as I pointed out, Harry is way too blasé about this supernatural occurrence. Previously, strange things happened around him, and he didn't realize that he made them happen because, as I pointed out, the Dursleys never actually explained to him that he was a wizard. However, in this instance, he absolutely is making something happen, and he embraces this weird ability of his. The only way I could possibly buy into this making even the slightest bit of sense is if Harry was so sheltered from his life at Privet Drive that he honest to goodness didn't know that talking to snakes was supposed to be abnormal. After all, by Harry's standards, a day at the zoo in the first place is already abnormal, so maybe this is the first snake he's ever seen in his life, and therefore maybe he genuinely thought that snakes were just as capable of human speech as parrots are. But that is clearly not what is happening here. As soon as the snake winked at Harry, Harry looked around to make sure nobody was watching, so clearly he knew that people would see this as strange if they knew he was doing it. Another instance of foreshadowing that fails on nearly every conceivable level is Harry's untidy hair. Unlike Dumbledore's leg scar, the fact that Harry's hair absolutely refuses to be combed will actually come up multiple times in the series. But at no point does it ever really amount to anything or contribute to the story in any way. The closest we ever get to Harry's hair being a plot point is in Order of the Phoenix, on the morning of Harry's underage magic trial, when Molly Weasley laments about how Harry's hair never lies flat. The implication here is that his unprofessional-looking hair will actually count against him when he's trying to look his best for the upcoming hearing. However, that plot point is quickly swept aside when Harry is thrown numerous other curveballs, including the last-minute rescheduling of the trial and the fact that he was to be tried before the whole Wizened Gamut. Harry's hair at that point seems like the least of their worries. This may be why, in a post-series interview, J.K. Rowling actually attempted to provide some backstory about Harry's hair. It turns out that Harry's paternal grandfather, that's James Potter's dad, had the same wild, untamable hair as his grandson. Well, if that was the case, why didn't James also have that hair? If that was a recessive gene, then that would mean that Lily also had the recessive gene lurking inside her, which means that Petunia shouldn't be so pissed off about the hair, since it already ran in her family. But anyway, to combat his own untamable hair, he invented what would be known as Slick Easy's hair potion, and later sold the recipe for a small fortune. In other words, J.K. Rowling is trying to retroactively tie Harry's hair into who he is by indirectly and distantly making it responsible for his large inheritance that he got from his parents. These post-series lore contributions will actually come into play during this retrospective quite a lot, so get used to them. However, let me just lampshade this by saying that I personally feel that these post-series lore contributions feel rather duct-taped onto the story. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at a different story that was improved upon by the author after it was already published, but in my opinion did it a lot better. Batman Under the Red Hood. This was a direct-to-DVD movie that was based on the Red Hood story arc from the Batman comic books from November 2004 to March 2006. This comic book story arc was considered to be mostly mediocre. The film, however, made numerous improvements to the story when it retold the story. However, this movie actually had a rather unique, extenuating circumstance behind it. The guy who wrote the Red Hood comic book story arc, Judd Winnick, also wrote the screenplay for this film adaptation. So with this film adaptation, Winnick actually got a chance to do an honest-to-goodness do-over for his own story. Such an opportunity is exceptionally rare, because both the film and comics were written by the same guy, and because Winnick used the benefit of hindsight to make multiple improvements to his own story, many DC fans consider this film adaptation to be canon over the comics. You rarely hear that about any film adaptation of anything. There's a review of this movie on a channel called Geekvolution that really hits it out of the park when analyzing that story, and I will provide a card to that review right here. Here, J.K. Rowling isn't even redoing her novels. She doesn't even have the exceptionally rare opportunity that was given to Judd Winnick to actually redo her story. Her original 7 novels aren't being replaced as canon. She's not wiping the slate clean and starting from square one. She's just duct taping new details onto the series after the series had already concluded. So her attempts at adding additional lore to the series comes off as just a little bit tacked on, if you ask me. At the end of the chapter, Harry mentions that he had given up the hope that someone would come and whisk him away to a place where he could be happy. This is, once again, J.K. Rowling's inexperience as an author rearing its ugly head. All this does is create fake drama. While Harry may have believed that he was doomed to live with the Dursleys forever, we the audience know that someone will eventually come and do exactly that. Even if you're reading the series for the first time, this is not a surprise, because if you're reading the chapters in order, and I honestly can't think of a good reason why you would read them out of order, we already read Dumbledore's, Hagrid's, and McGonagall's conversation, where Dumbledore explicitly made clear his intention to bring Harry back into their world once he's old enough to handle his own fate. The various strange things that often happen around Harry are likewise false mysteries. While Harry doesn't understand what's going on, we the audience have already met 3 characters who are all magical. Since those 3 characters also placed Harry at the Dursleys' doorstep with every intention of coming back for him later, we likewise have put 2 and 2 together that Harry is also magical. So when these strange things happen around Harry, the only thing that's actually a shock for us is that Harry doesn't understand what's going on. We know full well what's going on. For this reason, I believe this chapter would have been a much better first chapter to the series than the previous one. The first chapter in a book franchise is primarily responsible for setting the stage for the rest of the series, so how well it manages to do that is paramount to its success, and I believe this chapter does a much better job of setting the stage than the previous chapter did. Imagine if this book had the first chapter removed in its entirety. We begin the story with Harry being woken up while inside his cupboard. All of the strange things that happen around Harry would therefore be just as mysterious to us as they are to him. When Harry laments that nobody will ever come and take him away to a place where he can be happy, we likewise will have no direct evidence to the contrary at this point, and so we would empathize with Harry a lot more. As it stands, however, this chapter merely serves as fake drama, making Harry's dilemma seem hopeless when we already know full well that it isn't. As far as Harry's character is concerned, because this is the first chapter where Harry serves as the POV character, he gets the lion's share of character development in this chapter. The Dudleys are also shown to be abusive and mean-spirited, and Dudley is shown to be a spoiled brat, but that was already pretty well established in the previous chapter, so Harry gets the majority of non-redundant character development this time around. He is portrayed as a timid, quiet boy who prefers lack of confrontation. The Super Carlin brothers have made a video where they make a surprisingly strong case for the Dursleys' abuse of Harry, inadvertently shaving Harry into the hero he will eventually become. I'll provide a card for their video right here. However, one thing I feel Rowling dropped the ball on regarding Harry's character development is he has suffered virtually no psychological damage as a result of all this abuse. In the real world, if somebody had been abused all his life like Harry did, by this point in his life he either would have killed himself or went on some mass murdering spree until the police were forced to kill him just to stop him. Instead, Harry seems surprisingly well adjusted save for his modesty and humility, despite not having any real source of positive emotions his entire life. When Harry begins life at Hogwarts, he seems totally polite to everyone around him. He is able to make friends with Ron Weasley literally his first day at Hogwarts, despite having literally zero practice at the whole making friends business up to that point. Frankly, Harry isn't meant to have much of a personality. He is intended to be a blank slate so the audience can imagine themselves as him. This of course means that he can't suffer any real psychological damage from his abuse, because then audiences who don't have the same psychological suffering wouldn't be able to very readily insert themselves into his shoes. However, the whole audience insert concept is total bullshit anyway. Audiences want to follow characters who actually have personalities. Bear in mind that this isn't a story where the audience has any means of influencing the story through their own choices. This isn't a video game, well, at least not yet anyway, nor is this a choose-your-own-adventure book. Unless you're telling a story in one of those two formats, you have no business having a protagonist whose primary purpose is to give the audience a pair of vaguely defined shoes to insert themselves into, to the exclusion of all other character traits. So this is a huge strike against the series as a whole. In addition to having villains with no depth, we also have a protagonist who has no character of any kind. Well, next chapter, Harry will finally get his wish, and he will be invited to be whisked away to a place where he can be happy. But first, he'll have to fight his aunt and uncle to get it. So tune in next time when I discuss and analyze Chapter 3, The Letters from No One. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later.